Exercise. Briefly state what is meant by friction. Briefly explain what is meant by static friction. Briefly explain what is meant by limiting friction. Under what circumstances does dynamic friction act? What are the two main factors that limiting friction depends on? State a factor on which friction does not depend. So these are the questions given to you in your textbook. I am sure you have already answered these questions. Let us discuss the answers. Briefly state what is meant by friction. So students, by now you know friction acts in two different situations. One is on an object that is trying to move, and the other instance on an object that is moving. So here we can say the force exerted by the contact surface against the tendency of an object to move or on an object that is in relative motion to the contact surface. So here we are briefly stating what friction is, but we need to include the 2 points. So here when an object is trying to move, the opposing force or the opposing force on a moving object, and the force is exerted by the contact surface. So and also it's against the movement. So these are the points that have to be included when you explain friction. The next one, briefly explain what is meant by static friction. This is the frictional force that is exerted by the contact surface when an object tries to move, but still it does not move. So here we can say the frictional force exerted by the contact surface when an object tries to move relatively to the surface. Still, the object has not started moving. That is something you need to remember. We'll go to the next question. Briefly explain what is meant by limiting frictional force. This is the maximum frictional force that can be exerted by a contact surface against the object in contact with it. So we can explain it as the maximum friction that can be exerted between two surfaces in contact. That is the limiting friction. Under what circumstances does dynamic friction act? So when you see the term dynamic, you know that the object is moving. So this is the friction exerted by the contact surface against a moving object. So here, since they have asked for the circumstance, we have to say when the object is moving or once the object starts to move. So here we can say when an object is moving relative to the surface in contact. So that is when the dynamic friction acts on the object. We'll go to the next question. What are the two main factors that limiting friction depends on? So we know there are two factors that affect the limiting friction. What are they? Nature of contact surface and the perpendicular reaction or the normal reaction. So here we need to write the factors: nature of contact surface and perpendicular or normal reaction. And you know, students, the factor that does not affect the limiting frictional force. That is the area of the contact surface. State a factor on which friction does not depend. That is the next question. So here we have to say surface area of the contact surface. So we will move on to the next question. Give two benefits of friction. Give two disadvantages of friction. It is dangerous to drive vehicles with tires that have worn out grooves on rainy days. Explain why. Write down two methods used to reduce friction. Let us answer these questions now. Give two benefits of friction. There are many different benefits. We are able to walk because of friction. We are able to hold on to things because of friction. And the vehicles don't skid off the road because of friction. You can write any two benefits. So I will say we can walk without slipping. Then we can easily hold on to things because of friction. So like this, you can give any two benefits. Here I have written these two benefits. Give two disadvantages of friction. We have discussed this before. You know the answers. There is lot of loss of energy due to friction, and the machines become hot because of friction. And also the parts of machines wear off easily. We can write any two of those disadvantages. Two disadvantages: excess heat is produced when a machine functions. The second one, we can say parts of machines wear off quickly. So these are disadvantages of friction. We'll move on to the next question. It is dangerous to drive vehicles with tires that have worn out grooves on rainy days. So there are two things that you need to consider. You know the reason why there are grooves present on tires. That is to allow the water on road to pass off so that the water does not reduce friction. So on rainy days, there will be lot of water that will reduce the friction. In addition to that, if the grooves are worn out, then there is less friction exerted by the tire. So this will make the vehicle to easily skid off the road. So you have to explain all that here. The question says, explain why. When grooves are worn off, water will not run off easily, and on rainy days the road will be wet. This will decrease the friction between the road and the tire. So here you can see tire can be either spelled as T-I-R-E or T-Y-R-E. Therefore, the vehicle can skid off the road easily. So that is what you have to explain here. It is dangerous to drive vehicles on a rainy day with worn out tires. Write down two methods used to reduce friction. So here two methods that are used to reduce friction. you know 3 methods. Making the surface smooth. So, to do that you can polish the surface. We can apply lubricants or lubricating agents like graphite, grease or lubricating oils. And also we can use ball bearings or roller bearings. Here we can write any 2 methods. So, I will say one method by applying lubricants, and the second one using ball bearings and roller bearings. So students, we have come to the end of the questions in your textbook. But these are not enough to practice. So we will discuss some more additional questions related to friction. Extra question 1. A wooden block was placed on a table and a Newton balance was attached to it during an activity carried out to measure the friction exerted by the surface. So, this is to measure the friction exerted by the surface. They are doing an activity. The Newton balance showed a reading of 15 Newton when the wooden block just started to move. And a picture of the setup during the activity is shown here. So, here you can see the wooden block is given to you. The mass of the wooden block is given as 4 kilograms. The weight is acting downwards and R is the perpendicular reaction. And you can see how the Newton balance is attached to the wooden block and it is pulled horizontal to the surface. And here you can see the table surface is also a horizontal surface. And the questions related to this are, what is the name given for the friction acting on the wooden block before it starts to move? If the force acting on the wooden block is increased gradually, what is the name given to the maximum frictional force exerted by the surface just before the block starts to move? What is the value of that frictional force? What is the weight of the block? What is the perpendicular reaction acting on the block? What is the value of the unbalanced force acting on the block when the Newton balance reading is 20 Newton? Calculate the acceleration of the block when a force of 20 Newton is applied. So students, I read out the questions for you all. You can quickly answer them and then you can listen to the discussion so that you will answer the question first and then you can verify the answer. Now I will move on to the first question. A wooden block was placed on a table and a Newton balance was attached to it during an activity carried out to measure the friction exerted by the surface. So, here we want to measure the friction exerted by the surface. The Newton balance showed a reading of 15 Newton when the wooden block just started to move. So, that means it is the limiting frictional force acting on the wooden block. First question. So, the first question, what is the name given for the friction acting on the wooden block before it starts to move? Note the word before it starts to move. So, that is the friction acting on the block when it is stationary. You know the name of that friction. That is static friction. So here we have to write the answer as static friction, or you can say static frictional force. Both are same. We'll go to the next question. If the force acting on the wooden block is increased gradually, so we are increasing the force applied, what is the name given to the maximum frictional force exerted by the surface just before the block starts to move? The previous question, it said when the block is not moving. Here, just before the block starts to move. So here the static frictional force has increased and it has reached the maximum limit. Then what do we call it? Yes, it is the limiting frictional force or limiting friction. Limiting frictional force, or you can write it as limiting friction. What is the value of that frictional force? In the question, if you can remember, I will go back to the previous slide. You can see the force or the Newton balanced reading was 15 Newton when the block just started to move. So we consider that value as the limiting frictional force. I'll go back to the question. What is the value of that frictional force? We have to write it as 15 Newton. That is the limiting frictional force. The next question, what is the weight of the block? So here in the diagram, you can see the mass of the block is given to you 4 kg. You already know from the Newton's second law of motion, we can calculate the weight of the object. What is the equation for that? We have to use weight W equals mass into gravitational acceleration. So mass is given to you 4 kg and gravitational acceleration, we take it as 10 meters per second square. So that will be equal to 40 Newton. Kilogram meters per second squared is equal to Newton. 40 Newton is the weight of the object. What is the perpendicular reaction acting on the block? From the diagram, you can see the weight and the perpendicular reaction are opposite to each other. And if the object is at rest, it is at rest. Why? It's not moving upwards or downwards. So that means the weight is equal to perpendicular reaction. So here we need to find the perpendicular reaction. That is equal to 40 Newton. So I can say perpendicular reaction R is equal to weight of the object. So that is equal to 40 Newton. You don't have to do the calculation again. You can write the value directly. We'll move on to the next question. What is the value of the unbalanced force acting on the block when the Newton balance reading is 20 Newton? They want us to find the unbalanced force. From the question, you can remember, students, the limiting frictional force is 15 Newton. So after 15 Newton, the block will start to move. The dynamic friction decreases slightly, but still we will consider it as 15 Newton. So the applied force is 20 Newton. Frictional force that is acting against it is 15 Newton. So the difference between the two forces will be the unbalanced force. So here I can write it as unbalanced force is equal to applied force minus friction. So that will be 20 Newton minus 15 Newton. And the value will be 5 Newton. That is the unbalanced force acting on the wooden block. Calculate the acceleration of the block when a force of 20 Newton is applied. Although we apply 20 Newton force, only 5 Newton is the unbalanced force that will cause the acceleration. So to find acceleration, we have to use the equation for Newton's second law of motion. That is F equals ma, and F is the unbalanced force that is equal to 5 Newton. So here we can calculate mass is given to you. You can see in the diagram 4 kilogram into acceleration is equal to 5 Newton. So acceleration is 5 Newton divided by 4 kilogram. If we divide 5 by 4, 1.25 meters per second square. That will be the acceleration of the object. 1.25 meters per second square. We'll go on to the next question. Extra question 2. So here a diagram is given to you. You can see in A, B and C instances there is one block and the Newton balance reading is given as 2.5 Newton. In B there are two blocks, reading is 4 Newton, and in C there are 3 blocks and the reading of the Newton balance is 6 Newton. So from the picture you can identify what activity is being given to you. Force was applied by a Newton balance on a 20 Newton block placed on a horizontal table as shown in the diagram above. So here this is to test the effect of perpendicular reaction on limiting frictional force. Another block was placed on top of the first one and the reading of the balance was obtained. And the questions are, what was the purpose of increasing the number of blocks? Explain limiting frictional force. What can you conclude from the above activity? State another factor that affects limiting frictional force. When is the Newton balance reading high? When the object is moving or just before it starts to move? So answer the questions quickly and then listen to the discussion. Force was applied by a Newton balance on a 20 Newton block placed on a horizontal table as shown in the diagram. So here the weight of the block is 20 Newton. Another block was placed on top of the first one and the reading of the balance was obtained. So here you can see the 3 different readings. What was the purpose of increasing the number of blocks? You know the purpose. When we increase the number of blocks, the weight of the blocks increases. Therefore, the perpendicular reaction increases. So here we can say when the number of blocks are increased, the perpendicular reaction. You know another name for perpendicular reaction? It is known as normal reaction. So, perpendicular reaction or normal reaction increases. So, that is the purpose of increasing the number of blocks. We'll move on to the next part. Explain limiting frictional force. This is something that you know very well. I am sure you have written the correct answer. What is it? The maximum frictional force exerted by the contact surfaces of two bodies in contact with each other. So here it is the maximum frictional force exerted by the surfaces of two bodies in contact with each other. So that is the limiting frictional force. What can you conclude from the above activity? What is the observation? It's given to you here. When the number of blocks increase, you can see the Newton balance reading. 2.5 Newton, 4 Newton, 6 Newton. That is also increasing. And the Newton balance reading is the limiting frictional force. So, the conclusion of the activity will be what? Yes, students, you all know the conclusion. When perpendicular reaction increases, the limiting frictional force increases. Yes, so that is what we have to write here. The limiting frictional force increases with increase in perpendicular reaction. So, you can give a very short answer. Next part. State another factor that affects limiting frictional force. So, students, you know there are two factors. We discussed one, the perpendicular reaction. What is the next one? Yes, it is the nature of the contact surface. So, a direct answer, you can write nature of the contact surface. Next question. When is the Newton balance reading high? So, they want you to identify when the Newton balance gives a high reading. When the object is moving or just before it starts to move. So, here there are two states of friction involved. When the object is moving, it is the dynamic frictional force, and just before it starts to move, it is the limiting frictional force. And you know very well, students, the limiting frictional force is slightly greater than the dynamic frictional force. So then the answer will be just before it starts to move. We have to write the answer as just before it starts to move. That is the answer for this question. Now we will move on to the next question. Extra question 3. A table being pushed on a horizontal floor is shown in the diagram given below. So here you can see a person is trying to push the table that is kept on a horizontal floor. The questions are, when the table was pushed with a small force, it did not move. What is the name given to the frictional force acting on the table when it did not move? Indicate the direction of the force you mentioned in part 1 above in the diagram. Third one, the table did not move when it was pushed with a force of 50 Newton. What is the frictional force acting on the table? Part 4, the maximum frictional force exerted by the floor was determined to be 70 Newton. Write the magnitude of the force just enough to make the table move. 5. Write 2 changes that could be carried out to decrease the friction of the floor. 6. Perpendicular reaction of the object is a factor that affects the limiting frictional force. Under that, what is the other factor that affects limiting frictional force? Write the steps of an activity carried out to demonstrate the effect of the factor you mentioned in part 1 above. Write a disadvantage of frictional force. So these are the questions. You'll answer it first and then you can compare your answers with my discussion. I will move on to the first part of the question. A table being pushed on a horizontal floor is shown in the diagram given below. You can see that here. When the table was pushed with a small force, it did not move. What is the name given to the frictional force acting on the table when it did not move? A direct question, and I am sure you know the answer. When we apply a force, the force that prevents the object from moving is the static frictional force. So here we write the answer as static frictional force. Next question. Indicate the direction of the force you mentioned in part 1 above in the diagram. So the static friction will act against the force we apply. So here you can see the person is pushing the table towards this side. So the static friction will act towards the opposite direction. It will act at this point and this point as well. So here they want you to show only the direction. So if we show the direction, that is enough. The table did not move when it was pushed with a force of 50 Newton. What is the frictional force acting on the table? You know, students, according to the Newton's law, until an unbalanced force is applied, an object at rest remains stationary. So here the object did not move. That means there is no unbalanced force. Applied force is 50 Newton, so the frictional force has to be 50 Newton. So since the applied force is 50 Newton, frictional force equals the applied force, and that is equal to 50 Newton. Next part, the maximum frictional force exerted by the flow was determined to be 70 Newton. So that is the limiting frictional force. Write the magnitude of the force just enough to make the table move. So from the activities, you know students, the limiting frictional force is equal to the force that we apply just when the object starts to move. So here they want you to write the magnitude of the force just enough to make the table move. That is equal to 70 Newton. Write two changes that could be carried out to decrease the friction of the flow. We have discussed this before and I am sure you know the answer and you have written it correctly. We can polish the flow and make it smooth. We can apply a lubricating agent. But here, since they ask flow, we can't use roller bearings or ball bearings. Those are used in machines or parts of vehicles. So here, write two changes that could be carried out to decrease the friction of the flow. So we can say we can smoothen the flow or we can make the surface of the flow smooth. So that is one change. Make the flow smooth. Or else we can apply a polish. By applying a polish also, we can make the flow smooth. So that is another way of decreasing the friction of the flow. So here we can say polish the flow. Normally when we apply polish and then apply wax and polish it again, the flow becomes shiny as well as very smooth. So we tend to slip usually. So those are two methods by which we can decrease the friction of the flow. Now we will move on to the next question. Perpendicular reaction of the object is a factor that affects the limiting frictional force. What is the other factor that affects limiting frictional force? I am sure you have written the correct answer. It is the nature of the contact surface. This is the factor that affects limiting frictional force. Write the steps of an activity carried out to demonstrate the effect of the factor you mentioned in part 1 above. So to test the effect of nature of contact surface, what did we do? We use different types of sandpaper. Sandpaper with different roughness was pasted to the table or you can paste it to a wooden block. Then you attach the wooden block to a Newton balance and pull it horizontally and get the reading of the balance just when the block starts to move. We repeat the activity with sandpapers of different roughness. Then you can compare the values and demonstrate how the roughness affects the limiting frictional force. So here we need to write the steps of an activity. So I can say paste sandpaper of least roughness to the surface of a wooden block and pull it using a Newton balance. Second step, note the reading of the balance just when the block starts to move, and then use sandpapers of different roughness and repeat the procedure. Repeat the steps using sandpaper of different roughness and compare the results. So those are the steps of the activity that you need to do in order to test the effect of the nature of the contact surface on limiting frictional force. Now let us move on to the next question. Write a disadvantage of frictional force. There are many disadvantages. Loss of energy as heat due to the friction between parts of machines is one such disadvantage. So we can write that as the answer here. Production of heat and loss of energy due to friction between parts of a machine. So that is a disadvantage of friction. Another disadvantage is the wearing off of parts of machine. So I have written this here. You can write any one of the disadvantages. With that, we will move on to the next question. Extra question 4. When machines are operated, there is a frictional force acting between the surfaces in contact with one another against their relative motion. An activity carried out to investigate a factor that affects friction is shown in the diagrams 1 and 2 below. So here you can see in the first diagram there is a block, They haven't mentioned whether it's a wooden block or anything, but you can see it is a block, and to that a Newton balance or a spring balance is connected. In the second diagram, you can see that there are two similar blocks, and to the block that is at the bottom, there is a Newton balance connected. So, you know this activity. We have discussed this before in the lesson. What is the factor investigated in the activity above? What is the factor that should be maintained constant in the above activity? What is meant by dynamic friction? Write the methods used to increase the friction in the instances given below. The first one is climbing a tree, and the second one, tires of a vehicle. There is a high probability of vehicles involving in accidents on an inclined road on a rainy day. Why? So, these are the questions related to this activity and friction. You all answer the question first, then listen to the discussion. I will move on to the first question. When machines are operated, there is a frictional force acting between the surfaces in contact with one another against their relative motion. So, here they have defined or explained an instance of friction, and you know what that instance is. It is the dynamic frictional force, because when they are in relative motion. An activity carried out to investigate a factor that affects friction is shown in the diagrams 1 and 2 below. So, you know normally there are 3 instances for friction, and we test or investigate the factors that affect limiting frictional force. And from this diagram, you all know what factor is being investigated. The first question, what is the factor investigated in the activity above? I am sure you know the answer, students. When we use 1 cube, the weight is 1 unit, let's say 10 newtons. But if we use 2 identical cubes, then the weight becomes double. If this is 10, this becomes 20 newton. What changes with the weight of the object? Yes, the perpendicular reaction. So, here we are testing or investigating the effect of perpendicular reaction on limiting frictional force. What is the factor investigated in the activity? For this, you can say the effect of perpendicular reaction. There is another name for perpendicular reaction. You all know that name. What is it? It's normal reaction. So, instead of perpendicular reaction, you can also write as normal reaction. What is the factor that should be maintained constant in the above activity? So, you know that when we do an activity, except for the factor that is being investigated, all the other factors have to be maintained constant. And there are 2 factors that affect limiting friction. One is this, the other one is the nature of the contact surface. So, we have to maintain that constant. So, here the answer will be nature of contact surface. Let's move on to the next question. What is meant by dynamic friction? So, this is the state of friction when 2 objects in contact with each other are moving relative to one another. So we can define dynamic friction as the frictional force or friction exerted by the surface against the motion of a moving object in contact. So this is a very simple way of explaining dynamic friction. Write the methods used to increase the friction in the instances given below. So here it is increase the friction. Students, you have to remember when you read questions like these, especially related to friction, you have to understand what they mean from the question. Here you have to use the method that is used to increase friction. First instance is climbing a tree. Normally, you have seen this in different places where people climb very tall trees, like coconut trees, to pluck coconut. Then they have to use their hands and legs to climb that tall tree. And during that time, they use the grip of their hands as well as their feet to hold on to the tree. But that might not be enough if they are climbing a tall tree. Then what they use is, they use a loop made out of coil fibers. A coil rope is made into a ring like this. If they have a ring like this and this is made out of coil, so that means it has very high friction. So students, you can remember we have discussed this before. When fibers taken from different plants are twisted together, for example, coconut fibers are twisted together, we get the coil rope. And this coil rope has a very high friction due to the fibers present. And they make a loop out of the coil rope. And this is put around the feet, and with that rope, they can hold on to the tree more easily due to the increased friction. And the coil rope loop helps them to climb the tree easily. So here, since they have asked the method used to increase friction in climbing a tree, we can say a loop made with coil rope can be used to climb trees. A loop made with coil ropes is used to increase the grip when climbing tall trees. So this is an instance. The second one, tires of vehicles. This is also familiar to you all students. What do the tires have? They have grooves. So the grooves etched on tires, the surface of the tire, increases the friction between the road and the vehicle, so that the vehicle doesn't skid off the road. So we can write that here. Grooves etched on the surface of tires increase friction between the vehicle and the road, thus prevent the vehicle from skidding. So if we write this answer, that would be sufficient. Now the next question. There is a high probability of vehicles involving in accidents on an inclined road on a rainy day. They have asked why. So here again there are 2 points that you have to consider. It is an inclined road and it is a rainy day. So when there is an inclined road, it's like this. Either you're coming down along the road or you're trying to climb up the road. What happens is, due to this inclination, if this is the vehicle, the weight of the vehicle will be acting downwards. So when the vehicle is moving down, there will be a little more force towards the downwards direction, or if the vehicle is trying to move upwards, the weight will be pulling it down. So on a road like this, if it is a rainy day, there will be more water and the road will be wet. Due to this wetness, the friction of the road will decrease. And both these together will give a higher probability for the vehicle to skid off the road. So here we have to explain both. Due to inclination, the weight of the vehicle will act downwards. And the second point, we have to write about the rainy day. Due to the rain water, the roads will be wet. This reduces friction. So from this we can say that there is high probability of vehicles involving in accidents on an inclined road on a rainy day. So these two are the reasons. I can complete the answer by saying, therefore, there is a high probability of accidents on an inclined road on rainy days. So that is to complete the answer. Now let us move on to the next question. Extra question 5. you are required to carry out an activity to investigate the effect of the nature of contact surface on limiting friction. You are provided with 2 wooden blocks. Write 2 materials not mentioned above that is needed for the activity. Write 2 readings that you will need to write down during the activity. What can you conclude from the above activity? Write the factor that should be kept constant during the activity. So these are very simple questions related to the activity where we investigate the effect of nature of contact surface on limiting friction. Now that you can answer the questions first and then you can listen to the discussion. So the first question, here they say to investigate the effect of the nature of contact surface on limiting friction. And only 2 wooden blocks are given to us. Students, you can remember the activity where we investigated the effect of nature of surface. What did we do? We have to paste the sandpapers with different roughness onto the wooden block or the horizontal table, and then we place the wooden block and pull it along that rough surface. And we determine or get the reading of the Newton balance, which will give you the limiting frictional force. That is just when the block starts to move. And then we compare the force needed to just make the block move. That is the limiting frictional force. So let us answer the questions. Write 2 materials not mentioned above that is needed for the activity. So they have given us 2 wooden blocks. In order to test the nature of contact surface, we will need the sandpapers, and to measure the limiting frictional force, we need the Newton spring balance. So those are the 2 materials. Sandpaper with different roughness and Newton spring balance. Write 2 readings that you will need to write down during the activity. What are the readings that you will need? The limiting frictional force when we use a sandpaper of less roughness. Another reading, the limiting frictional force or the reading of the Newton balance when we use a sandpaper of high roughness. So those are the 2 readings that we need. I can write it down. Newton balance reading when sandpaper with less roughness is used. That is one reading. Then the other one is the Newton balance reading when sandpaper with high roughness is used. Newton balance reading when sandpaper with high roughness is used. So those are the readings. Now we'll go on to the next question. What can you conclude from the above activity? You all know what the observation would be. When we use a sandpaper of less roughness, the Newton balance reading will be less. And when we use a sandpaper of high roughness, the Newton balance reading will be high. That means when the roughness of the surface increases, the limiting frictional force increases. So that will be the conclusion of the activity. So we can say limiting frictional force increases with the increase in roughness of the contact surface. Next one, write the factor that should be kept constant during the activity. The factor that should be constant. We have discussed this before. There are two factors. One is the nature of contact surface. We are investigating the effect of that. So we have to maintain the second factor, that is the perpendicular reaction or the normal reaction constant. So here the factor will be perpendicular reaction, or you can write it as normal reaction. We'll move on to the next question. Extra question 6. The figure below shows a wooden block placed on a rough horizontal surface. A hook is fixed to one face of the block as shown in the figure. So here you can see in the figure the hook is fixed, that is the circle over there. The block is pulled in the direction indicated by the arrow using a twine tied to the hook. So here you can see the arrow is given, so the block is being pulled towards that side, and that is a twine attached to the hook. State the nature of the frictional force acting between the rough horizontal surface and the contact surface of the wooden block in the following instances. So here they have given you instances where you need to identify the type of frictional force. The block doesn't move when a force is applied. The block just starts to move in the direction of the applied force. The block is moving in the direction of the applied force. Second question, what is the unbalanced force acting on the wooden block in part 1 mentioned above? So this is part 1, in that the first part. Third question, state one method of decreasing the friction between the block and the contact surface. So these are the questions, students. I am sure you can answer them first and then we can discuss the answers. Now let me move on to the first question. Here you can see it is a wooden block. So the figure below shows a wooden block placed on a rough horizontal surface. A hook is fixed to one face of the block as shown in the figure that we already discussed with the question. You can see the hook and the direction of motion is indicated by the arrow. The block is pulled in the direction indicated by the arrow using a twine tied to the hook. So this is the twine tied to the hook. State the nature of the frictional force. Nature of the frictional force acting between the rough horizontal surface and the contact surface of the wooden block in the following instances. So they have given you 3 different instances. First one, the block doesn't move when a force is applied. We are pulling it, but the block is not moving. That means just before it starts to move. That will be the static frictional force. So here it is the static frictional force. The block just starts to move in the direction of the applied force. We say the maximum force is exerted when the block just starts to move. And that is the, what is it? Limiting frictional force. Limiting frictional force. The block is moving in the direction of the applied force. So the surface exerts a friction on the moving object means we call it the dynamic frictional force. Dynamic frictional force. Now we will move on to the next question. What is the unbalanced force acting on the wooden block in part 1.1 mentioned above? Just to check the instance, I will go back to the question. This is part 1 and the first part is static frictional force means the block is not moving. So we apply a force and the surface exerts a force. They are both balanced. So what is the unbalanced force acting on the wooden block? It will be 0. So here we have to write 0. Or you can say no unbalanced force. State one method of decreasing the friction between the block and the contact surface. So to decrease the friction, we will have to change one of the factors that affect friction. And you all know the nature of surface affects the limiting friction. And when we smoothen the surface, it becomes less friction. So therefore, in order to decrease the friction, we can say polish the surface of the table. So here that is one way, polish the surface of the table. If it is a wooden table, once you polish it also the surface becomes smooth. In addition to that, if you apply varnish, that makes the surface even more smoother. So here since they have asked only for one method, we will stick with this answer. Let us move on to the next question. Extra question 7. When there is a relative motion between two surfaces in contact, the resistive force exerted by the contact surface against the motion is known as friction. So here they have explained what friction is. And there is a diagram given to you. Now you are very familiar with this diagram. A wooden block attached to a twine, and to that a Newton balance is connected. And here they say two different forces, 5 Newton and 10 Newton. A force is applied on a wooden block towards the AB direction by a Newton balance as illustrated in the diagram above. So that is why they have given this AB direction. The balance is connected to the hook fixed to the block. Instances related to the above activity are given below. The first instance, wooden block didn't move when forces of 5 Newton and 10 Newton were applied. Why? Wooden block just started to move when the force was increased to 15 Newton. Wooden block moves in the direction of a larger applied force. So you can see these are the 3 different instances of frictional force. First question, identify the frictional forces acting in the instances X, Y and Z. Write 2 factors that affect the limiting frictional force. Third, what is the difference between the limiting frictional force and the dynamic frictional force? 4. Plot a graph to illustrate the change of the frictional force with the applied force. Plot the frictional force in the y-axis and the applied force in the x-axis. Fifth one, what is the factor that does not affect the limiting frictional force? And the sixth question, write an activity to demonstrate that the factor you mentioned above does not affect the limiting frictional force. So these are questions that are related to an activity that we have done before, but you have to think and write the answers. I'm sure you can do that. So you all write the answer first and then we will discuss. Now let me move on to the first question. When there is a relative motion between two surfaces. So here relative motion, two surfaces in contact, the resistive force exerted by the contact surface against the motion is known as friction. And you know that is one instance of friction. And we have discussed this activity. A force is applied on a wooden block towards the AB direction by a Newton balance as illustrated in the diagram above. The balance is connected to the hook fixed to the block. Instances related to the above activity are given below. Wooden block didn't move when forces of 5 Newton and 10 Newton were applied. That is X. Y, wooden block just started to move when the force was increased to 15 Newton. And Z is wooden block moves in the direction of a larger applied force. Identify the frictional forces acting in the instances X, Y and Z. I'm sure you would have already answered this. X is when the block is not moving with the two forces. What is that friction? Static frictional force or static friction. Static frictional force. Why wooden block just started to move. That means it is limiting frictional force. Y is limiting frictional force. And finally, Z wooden block moves in the direction of a larger applied force. So when the object is moving, the frictional force is dynamic friction. So here we can write it as dynamic frictional force. So those are the three instances. Let us look at the next question. Write two factors that affect limiting frictional force. So you know the two factors very well. One is the nature of contact surface. So that's the first one. Nature of contact surface. And the second factor also, you know very well, the normal reaction or the perpendicular reaction. I will write both the names. You can use only one term, normal or perpendicular reaction. What is the difference between the limiting frictional force and the dynamic frictional force? You know, when we are trying to pull an object, the surface exerts a force. With the increase in applied force, the frictional force increases and reaches a maximum value. That is the limiting frictional force. Once we overcome that and pull the block and the block starts to move, then it is the dynamic friction, which is slightly less than the limiting frictional force. So that is what we need to write here, the difference between limiting and dynamic. So we have to say dynamic frictional force is slightly less than the limiting frictional force. Next question. Plot a graph to illustrate the change of the frictional force with the applied force. Plot the frictional force in the y-axis and the applied force in the x-axis. So, x-axis has to be applied force What is the unit for applied force? It has to be in newtons. So you have to write the unit within brackets. And the frictional force in y-axis. So here we have to label it as frictional force. What is the unit? That is also in newtons. So we write Newton there. So now we have to calibrate the two axes. If you can remember, students, we apply 5 Newton and 10 Newton force. Then when 15 Newton is applied, the block just starts to move. I will confirm the values. We can go back to the question. Here you can see 5 Newton 10 Newton, and when it is 15 Newton, the block just starts to move. So those are the forces that we need to mark in the two axes. So first we apply 5 Newton force. Then I will mark that value here, 5. And when the applied force is 5 Newton, the block doesn't move. That means the frictional force is equal to the applied force. So that also is 5 Newton. We don't have to write Newton here because we have labeled the axis. So the first point will be 5 and 5. Then what happens? We increase the force to 10 Newton. So here when we increase the applied force to 10 Newtons, the frictional force also increases. That is why still the block does not move. So the frictional force will be 10 Newton. The second point is going to be here, 10 and 10. So at these 2 points, the block did not move. So the forces are equal. Then what do? We increase the force to 15 Newton and the block just starts to move. That is the point where we have the limiting friction. 15, and at the same time the friction is 50. So if you want, you can just write it as limiting friction there. In brackets, we can note it down. So if I mark the point for the third instance, it will be here. So if we connect the 3 points, it will be a straight line going through the point of origin. So you can see when the applied force increases, frictional force increases up to the limiting frictional force. So it is a direct proportional relationship. I will connect these 3 points. Connect the points. Okay. So here students, you can see when the applied force increases, the frictional force increases up to the limiting friction. Thereafter what happens? There is dynamic force acting on it, and the dynamic friction is slightly less than the limiting frictional force. So when the object is moving with a higher force, you will see that the frictional force is slightly less than this 15 Newton, which is the limiting frictional force. So this is how you are supposed to plot the frictional force versus the applied force. Let us move on to the next question. What is the factor that does not affect the limiting frictional force? You know the answer to this question. It is the surface area of the contact surface. So here I will write the answer as surface area of the contact surface. This is the factor that does not affect limiting frictional force. Write an activity to demonstrate that the factor you mentioned above does not affect the limiting frictional force. So we have mentioned the factor surface area of the contact surface. And I'm sure students, you can remember the activity to demonstrate that the surface area does not affect the limiting frictional force. What is the first step we do? We paste sandpaper on the surface of a wooden block that has different surface areas. So if you turn the faces, the surface areas have to be different. Then what do? We place the face with the highest surface area on a horizontal table and connect the Newton balance. We pull the Newton balance and get the reading just when the block starts to move. I'll write down those two steps first. So first, paste sandpapers on the faces of a wooden block with different surface area. The second step, place the highest surface area of the block on a horizontal surface. Pull the block using the Newton balance and get the reading as the block starts to move. And finally, what do? To compare the results and come to a conclusion, we repeat the same steps with faces of different surface areas. So I can say repeat the steps with different surface area. So when they ask you to write down the activity, you can write it briefly like this. So now we will move on to the next question. Extra question 8. These are different types of questions. You all know they are MCQ type or multiple choice questions. This comes in paper 1. Underline the most suitable answer. So here it is the most suitable answer. The frictional force that acts against the motion of a moving object is. You know the 3 states of friction. Static frictional force. When an object is trying to move relative to the contact surface, the surface exerts a friction and balances the applied force. Then the object is not moving, so we call it static frictional force. That is just before the object starts to move. Dynamic frictional force is the frictional force exerted by the contact surface against the motion of an object. So that will be the relevant answer. We will look at the other answers. Limiting frictional force, that is the maximum frictional force that will be exerted or that can be exerted by a contact surface against the movement of an object. And perpendicular frictional force, that is normally the perpendicular force is the force acting against the weight of an object. But we don't have a perpendicular frictional force. So the correct answer for this question is dynamic frictional force, because it says motion of a moving object. Now the next question. Here a diagram is given to you. It is very familiar to you students. We have done this activity before. The limiting frictional force was determined with different surfaces of a wooden block as shown in the diagram above. So here you can see the surface areas are different. Effect of what factor on friction is investigated in the above. You can identify the factor, the surface area. Area of the contact surface. That is the factor that we are investigating. Perpendicular reaction, then we will have to place one block on top of the other to increase the weight so that the perpendicular reaction increases. If it is nature of contact surface, we will have to use sandpaper with different roughness. And static frictional force, that is using a normal block, we investigate the 3 states of friction. So the correct answer is the area of contact surface. We'll go on to the next question. Select the method used to reduce friction in day-to-day activities from below. So students, you all know there are different instances where friction is an advantage and instances where it becomes a disadvantage. So we have to reduce that frictional force. So here also we need to find an instance or method used to reduce friction. Grooves etched on tires, it increases the friction between the tire and the road. Using brake pads in bicycle, there also you need to have high friction so that the brake pads stop the bicycle when they touch the rim of the bicycle tire. Having ball bearings in parts of machine. That is the answer where we use a method to reduce friction. As you know, in machines, when there are contact surfaces moving against each other, due to friction, there can be lot of heat generated as well as the parts can wear off. So to prevent that, they use ball bearings. Another bearing that can be used is roller bearing. So that is the answer. Having patterns etched on the back of slippers, this is also to increase friction so that you can walk easily without slipping when you are wearing slippers. Next one. What is an advantage of frictional force? They want you to identify the advantage of frictional force. Applying lubricants to parts of machine. This also makes the surface of the machine smooth and makes it easier to slide one on top of the other. So therefore, lubricants reduce friction. Applying talc powder on a carom board. That also you all know. It reduces friction and make the disc easy to move. Disc and the coins move easily when there is talc powder. People can walk on foot. For this, of course, we need lot of friction. You all know there are markings on our palms as well as the sole of the feet. And this helps us to move because those markings increase friction. And that helps us to walk. So, it is an advantage of frictional force. Having roller bearings between contact surfaces of a motor vehicle. Roller bearings also reduce friction in parts of machinery in motor vehicles. So, the correct answer is the third answer. The next question. Consider the instances given below. A. Etching grooves on surfaces. B. Applying lubricating oil between contact surfaces. And C. Having roller bearings or ball bearings between contact surfaces. So, from the instances, you can see either they are trying to increase the frictional force or decrease the frictional force. Let us look at the question. Method used to increase frictional force from the instances given above. So, here you can see etching grooves increases friction, but applying lubricants decreases friction, and having roller bearings or ball bearings, that also decreases friction. So, it is only A. Answer is A only. Sixth one. A student applied talc powder on the carom board before the start of a game. What is the relevant scientific reason for this? First one, frictional force between contact surfaces will increase due to talc powder. That is wrong. You know talc powder acts as a lubricant. It reduces friction. Frictional force between contact surfaces will decrease due to talc powder. That is correct. The speed of the coin will increase due to the talc powder. No. The friction will decrease, but the speed of the coin will depend on how fast we knock or hit the disc. The speed of the coin will decrease due to the talc powder. That also will not happen. So, here the frictional force between the contact surfaces will decrease due to talc powder. So, that is the correct answer. We'll move on to the next question. An object kept on a smooth surface was made to move by applying a force. The correct order of frictional force acting between the contact surfaces. So, you know, initially when you pull the block or the object, it is the static frictional force, and it increases and reaches the maximum, that is the limiting frictional force. And when the object is moving, it is the dynamic frictional force. So, if we look at the different combinations, the first one is static friction, limiting friction and dynamic friction. That is the correct answer. Second one, dynamic friction is first. So, it's not correct. Third one, limiting friction is in first. So, that is also not correct. Fourth answer, static friction. After that, it is dynamic friction. So, that is also an incorrect order. So, we have selected the correct answer. The eighth question. A frictional force acts between two surfaces in contact only when there is a relative movement between the surface. No, it doesn't only happen when there is relative movement. Only when one surface is trying to relatively move on the other surface. That is also correct, but it's not only when it is trying to move. If you remember, students, we started off the lesson with these two examples. When an object is moving, there is frictional force. When an object is trying to move, there is frictional force. So, both instances have to be considered. Only when there is relative movement between the surfaces or when one surface is trying to relatively move on the other surface. So, this answer is the relevant answer. We will underline that, the third answer. Fourth one, only when there is no relative motion between the surfaces. If there is no relative motion, there is no frictional force. So, with this, we have answered all the extra questions. So, students, up to now, I discussed the lesson on frictional force, and also we discussed the questions in the textbook and more extra questions. I am sure now you have a very good understanding about what friction is and the different instances of friction, the factors that affect friction, and the advantages and disadvantages of friction, and how we can reduce the disadvantages. But that is not sufficient. You have to study the lesson again and again, read it, understand, get a better understanding, and practice more questions. That will help you to answer any type of question given in the